Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is an educator, author, columnist, and truth and politics panelist. Niigaan Sinclair is a professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba and a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press, who was named the 2018 Columnist of the Year by the National Newspaper Awards. Niigaan is also an author whose national bestseller, Winnipeg, Visions of Canada from an Indigenous Centre, won the 2024 Governor General's Award for Nonfiction. Niigaan is a sought-after public speaker and commentator on Indigenous issues, including on APTN's weekly Truth and Politics panel. Niigaan, thanks so much for being here with us today.
It's nice to be in studio, not just over Zoom and all of our shows that we do. So.
Some hotel room somewhere
right.
on the road.
Right.
Well, after 12 seasons, it seemed like a bit of an oversight that you hadn't been on Face to Face. And then I discovered in February 2016, former host Michael Hutchinson did have you on to talk about calls to require university students to learn about Indigenous peoples and history as part of earning a degree, something that was pretty controversial at that time, but something that I'm hoping we can maybe touch on here off the beginning, because it seems like it's kind of common now, right? Like a lot of universities have picked this up across the country.
Yeah, I mean, certainly has not without a lot of growing pains too. When I was on the show way back in the day, I was with Michael Hutchinson, the former host, and in those days I was the head of the Indigenous Studies department, which was going to do the lion's share of the courses that would be what's called the Indigenous credit requirement, which requires all art students. And we're talking about, almost 5,000 to 6,000 art students, brand new every year, never mind the 15 or so thousand that's kind of funnel their way through arts courses, to be required to take an Indigenous Studies credit. And that avalanched our department. It created a whole bunch of demands for us, and we've gone from, at the time, about 4 faculty members, we're now at 16. It's a radical shift and change, but it's also a good change, I think. It's created employability, because every single person in Manitoba you have to know how to work with, live beside, or be married to an Indigenous person. And so it's gone without a whole bunch of, with a whole bunch of growing pains and controversies. But, here we are now a decade later, and I think we're in a better place. Lots more work to do at the University of Manitoba to try to bring Indigenous pedagogies and peoples. But I think, we just I celebrate our 50th anniversary as a department, so it's a pretty exciting time.
Indeed. Well, as a university professor in Indigenous Studies, how have you seen what's taught and who's taking these courses change over the years?
Well, I mean, it used to be students choosing classes or being funneled through certain faculties like nursing or law or medicine. And now it's everybody. It's everybody. If you want to do a criminology degree, psychology degree, anthropology degree. And I think what that's created is it's created a way in which, if I were to say a glass half full way of thinking about it, students are learning these things for the first time, and sometimes they're surprised, and sometimes they have a lot of triggers. But you're also seeing this rise up of the most competent Indigenous generation in history in terms of being able to become all of these professional industries. All of our young people who are heading into, we have the largest on-campus community at the University of Manitoba this year, 3,480 First Nations, Inuit, Métis students, and that's the largest on-campus community ever in Canadian history on a university campus. And so I think that there's an interesting balance. You see all these new people who are entering into different industries, learning Indigenous studies for the first time, but then you also have these huge, competent, capable Indigenous professionals who are then sort of in the same classroom with them, and there's a lot of interesting conversations that take place.
Pretty awesome, right? 3,400 people, like you said. You had the 50th anniversary of the course this year when there was less than 50 Indigenous students at the university back then.
Yeah, well, there's lots of reasons to be pessimistic, Like, if you just look around, there's lots of reasons to feel like the world's burning. There's more Indigenous peoples in prisons, murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls, Two-Spirit peoples. There's lots of developments that have been very negative recently in terms of health, homelessness, addictions. But then you get to see this huge opportunity that's taking place, or this huge amount of students who are making it anyways and fighting through all of the different obstacles that our communities are within our communities, the policies, the fact that they still continue to be chronically underfunded schools that many of our people go through, whether that be in cities or on a reserve. And they're making it anyways. And it's this really remarkable time to be an educator, I think either in schools or in universities or colleges, because you get to see this future unfolding before its eyes. In 5 years here in Manitoba, you're going to see this explosion in certain industries, not just in law or education like it was back when I was a student. You're going to see all of it in every single industry: dentists, Indigenous composers, and Indigenous orchestras, and Indigenous people in worlds that we never could have possibly imagined, maybe even 20 years ago.
Right. Well, and you get to see this firsthand, like we said earlier, for loyal viewers of our weekly Truth in Politics panel. People know that you're on the road a lot and speaking with students, speaking with academics, unions, others. What's the message that you're taking to those groups and what's the reception?
So it used to be I'd have to explain what Indigenous knowledge is wherever I went, So like, I think many times I would go to a school and I'd say, okay, everybody, this is what Indigenous education is. And I would explain sort of what it is, going back to the early contact with missionaries, to talking about what it was when we built our lodges, even in the most direst of circumstances, what it is today, but I don't find that I don't have to do that as much anymore. What I'm arguing these days, or what I'm presenting on these days a lot more, is that reconciliation isn't the right thing to do, it's the only thing to do. I've given up really on this whole moral argument of trying to get people to think, oh, well, if we just treat Indigenous peoples like human beings, it's the right thing to do. I've given up on that because it's not getting a lot of headway. What I've started to argue is that working with Indigenous peoples is the most employable skill. It's the only way to get this country moving economically, and particularly it will deal with the most important crises that we're dealing with, which are situations of the economy, situations of the environment, and then overall this huge plethora of racism in all the different systems, but particularly justice, child welfare, education, health, all of those things that the TRC really identified. And so we have to not deal with those problems because we somehow have to make them just. And I think that that's a good argument, but doesn't get a lot of headway. We have to make it so because we have to deal with all these other challenges and this burgeoning United States, which keeps threatening to turn us into the 51st state and so on. And so I think that the only way we deal with that is we reconcile with Indigenous peoples, include them into the country fully and absolutely, and most importantly, recognize Indigenous sovereignty, because Indigenous sovereignty is how we're going to have clean air to breathe, and safe water to drink, and good food to eat, because it is Indigenous peoples who will be the ones who will be standing up for the caribou and the elk and the water and the rain and the rivers and so on. Has
the reception from these groups changed that you speak to?
Well, I'm on the road every week in 2 or 3 different cities, trying to talk, and I'm not the only person doing it. There are. I'm about to give a talk with Duncan McHugh, who is, of course, living in Ottawa, but continues to speak out in BC. And, of course, the great writer Tasha Spillett is always around in Toronto or Ottawa or doing great work there. And David Robertson, right here from Manitoba, talking about children's literature. I could name them all off of the people who are doing all this work. There's many of us. I often run into Pam Palmater, who's sometimes on the show, or Tanya Talega, who's doing great work and bringing documentaries to the surface. My point is that I think that we are at one of the most progressive times in history. And over the past 10 years, while we sometimes feel reconciliation's moving too slow and we can feel that it's frustrating, we also one of the most promising and hopeful times, I think, ever in our history.
It's not easy to speak to big groups of people or to students. I speak to hundreds of youth and educators 2 days a year at Vision Quest, and I don't sleep for like a week before. When did you find your voice?
Well, I had the front row seat to a master class of watching my father, so former Senator Murray Sinclair Abun, Commissioner of the TRC for those who might know my father, and he seems like he went to every single community, like almost every single community in Manitoba here, many of them throughout the country. He went to Métis settlements, he went to First Nations, he went to, every time he was invited to a boardroom or a courtroom or a classroom, he would try his best to make it there. And sometimes he'd speak to the entire school of grade 8s, or the next day he'd be speaking to judges, and the next day to academics. And I got to be the front row of many of those trips. I used to go when I was 4 or 5 years old, when he first started to become a lawyer, and then eventually become a judge, and then become a commissioner and the TRC, and then eventually a senator. And so I was able to watch all of that. And occasionally I would be invited to speak as well. And so I started to gain some of my voice through that. And then of course I became a high school teacher. And when you're a high school teacher, you better have good, entertaining jazz hands when you're a drama teacher like I was. And you better be willing to, take a group of grade 9 students who might not always want to be there and try to get them engaged and involved with what you're doing. And so that's what I really learned, where I really honed my skills, I think. But the biggest step in my career, I think, was during Idle No More. So Idle No More Winnipeg, that was a really big moment for me and many people in the community, where we really found our voice. We had always stood up for injustice, or stood up against injustice, going back to 1990. Oka was the most important moment in my life of understanding that there is injustice in this country. Indigenous peoples are being regularly targeted, and we had to stand up. We couldn't stand idly by. And Idle No More, though, was the day in which I took action. And my first moment was stepping up against a rural newspaper in Morris, Manitoba, against a small newspaper that was saying racist things about Indigenous peoples, and I brought the editor of that newspaper a cup of coffee and a Tim Hortons donut, and I wanted to invite him to a conversation. And that was the day really where I realized, all these media trucks were thinking I was going out to punch this guy in the face. But what I was really doing was I was saying, let's talk about treaty. Let's talk about the fact that you live in a town named after Alexander Morris, who was the original negotiator of Treaties 3s and above, and the renegotiator of Treaty 1 and 2. Like, you were only there because of treaty. And for you to say all these racist things about Indigenous peoples is just to not understand what you have benefited from.
Must have been some disappointed reporters there that day.
Well, they were all there. Every single news outlet, including this one, I think, was out there filming. And then when I didn't show up ready for a fight, and I was just standing there with a coffee and a pastry, I think there was a bit of disappointment.
It's a long drive to go for no fight. Niigaan, much more to talk about here. Just got to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation on Face to Face. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is author, columnist, and Professor Niigaan Sinclair. And Niigaan, as we've talked about a bit before, it's the 10th anniversary of the release of the TRC's calls to action. How do you think things are going?
I talked with my father about this a lot before he passed. Of course, my father passed away about a year ago, and he admitted to a lot of frustration, hoping that the TRC calls to action had been taken up more. The statistics are pretty frustrating in whatever way you look at it. About 14 of the 94 calls have been finished, whether we agree they're finished or not. That's generally what they're thought to be sort of completed. About 40 have been underway, or some progress has been made, but they certainly have been stalled recently. Very little action has been done over this most recent federal government. And then 40, nothing has ever been done. So it's very frustrating, and I think that many of us feel that there is a lack of commitment by this current federal government, led by Mark Carney, to evoke anything other than just more resource development, kind of harking back to the days of Stephen Harper. But at the same time, a Ledger poll came out just before this year's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which is one of the calls to action. And it said that we should have a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation to honor survivors and what happened at the residential schools, but most importantly, to commit to something to move forward. And that Ledger poll said that 35% of Canadians are going to put on an orange shirt and they're going to go to an event. Now, 35% means that 14 million Canadians are doing something on that day. Right. That's just one moment. It's 15 minutes really out of a year. 5 years ago, how many people would you have said had done that? I think that what that tells you is that 5 years ago, there would have been maybe a few hundred of us that maybe put an orange shirt on, went to an event on September 30th or June 21st or whatever day we choose to recognize Indigenous peoples. The fact that we've gone from a few hundred to 14 million in 5 years, I think is showing us that we've made some steps. And I'm not certainly apologizing or saying, hey, let's look at the bright side of things. All I'm saying is that we have done a lot of work to get to this place. Many of our ancestors worked very, very hard, survivors particularly, to get us to this place. And we seem to be moving, while frustratingly slow, also in ways we've never moved before. And 14 million Canadians for 15 minutes proved that we all matter, that all of us can walk together and live together and work together. Maybe we can do it for longer than 15 minutes.
Right. Wanted to mention, obviously, or get into your writing, and as we mentioned in the intro, you won Best National Columnist in 2018, but you haven't won since.
Oh, gee. What have you done for me lately?
No, I was going to say, how did you end up becoming this weekly columnist, and now even with your own newsletter?
Well, so the funny thing about that National Columnist of the Year award is I was only a columnist for 6 months. I wasn't even a columnist for a full year. And I think in many ways, I'll be completely honest, I kind of feel like I just came out of the gates, busting things down, talking really, very much I'd come out of the activist world. The reason I became a columnist was because I wrote a series of columns about the trial of the murder of Colton Bushy. And I wrote about the not guilty verdict for the murder of Tina Fontaine. And so I was very passionate talking. I was organizing marches at the time, and I would be writing the press releases for these marches. And I would send them to the Free Press, and the editor of the Free Press, Paul Simin, sent me an email and said, hey, have you ever thought about writing like a column or something for us? You could write something? And I was like, absolutely. And so I sort of scratched out a column about comparing the movie that nobody really watched now, but if you think about it, that movie Christian Bale's Hostiles. And then I compared that to the not guilty verdict for Gerald Stanley in the murder of Colton Bushy. And I said that this is basically about the Wild West and people who sort of see the Wild West as a place you can just harm Indigenous peoples and get away with it. And so I wrote that column, and then boom, next thing you know, I did two things. And I always say that you need two of the three things in the world. You got to be on time, you got to be flexible, or you got to be smart. And I really think I was the first two things, which is that I could meet a deadline and that I could be flexible. I'm not always so smart, but I think if you can always be two of those three things, that's what I tell my students, you'll always be successful. And so I think those have been my best things about being a columnist, is that I'm always, I hit a deadline and I can always be flexible. And whenever the paper asks me to write about something, I tend to write about it, unless I feel really passionate to not write about it or write about it in a different way. And it's now going on about 6-7 years now since I've been a columnist. Yeah,
2018. Yeah. I don't remember Hostiles. I remember that column though. A collection of those columns were selected for the book Winnipeg Visions of Canada from an Indigenous Center. You won the Governor General's Literary Award for nonfiction for the book. Some of us were talking about it this week though, and one person said that it's difficult to read at times because you kind of forget some of the stuff that happens here in Winnipeg and, how difficult things can be at times. What were you hoping to get across with the book?
Well, I have a piece in the book where I talk about we have to say the names of the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And I think that if a lot of people, when they read that piece, when you line them all up, just like we do in store windows, or people who do in homes, or people do on Red Dress Day, it's really overwhelming. It's overwhelming to see all the different things that happen in our community. One thing I did in that book, though, is I didn't just talk about some of the trauma and violence that have happened here, but the fact that we are ground zero for some of the best solutions, some of the strongest, most innovative resistances. And And we are the first place of treaty, we are the first province post-Confederation. And I think all of those things lead us to being the center of a lot of important conversations in the country that are simply not happening in Toronto and not happening in Montreal and not happening even in Vancouver. And so right here, Winnipeg, which represents, of course, not the city, but the ecology, everything that happens on the prairies from Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Northwest Territories, everything flows here. That we are ugly and some of the worst of this country, but we are also some of the best. Some of the most innovative, creative solutions come from this place. And you just have to look at the organizations, see the people, which is really highlighted. This is one of my favorite parts of the book, is that I was able to highlight some of my real heroes, people who have done amazing work like Leslie Spillett or Curtis Johnny, so the Shingoose, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of people don't remember that Shingoose passed away during the pandemic. This incredible singer that gave so much to our community, was not perfect by any means, but was so important that he was remembered by Max Gale, who was starring on the Barney Miller show in Hollywood. And I got a hold of him and interviewed him about what his experiences with Shingoose were like in the 1970s. My point is like, this place is a very special place that we live in, and I hope that that comes across in the book too.
Love Shingoose. Was very lucky to meet him before he passed. Niigaan, much more to talk about here, including some new works that you have coming out. We just need to step aside for one last break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Niigaan Sinclair, a professor and author and columnist who won an award 6 years ago for
bringing this up.
We were talking about your newsletter, and you teased in your newest newsletter that you have a new book coming out. The book, the column itself was about hate, and you said that that was something that you'd been thinking a lot about lately. Why is that the case, I guess?
So I was asked to give a talk just a little while ago in a conference called The Rise of Hate, which was, I was like, I don't know, what am I going to say about this conference? And so I looked up the Ojibwe word for hate. And I started thinking about the word for hate. And I had this really profound moment. Like you do, anyone who studies the language and spends time in our traditional ancestral ways that we see ourselves, you constantly sort of are amazed by our elders and by our huge, vast knowledge in our communities. And in the language, the word for hate, the stem is she at the front, which is the same word that we use to describe a rattlesnake, the same word we use to describe a duck, shiship, or the same word that we use to describe a shishiguan, which is a shaker. Like, that's fascinating. So we don't actually have a word for hate in our culture. What we have a word for is movement, or the sound of movement, which is where the rattlesnake comes in, where the duck vibration comes in, or the shishiguan, the shaker that we use to describe creation. So when things come together, they're not actually describing things like how we often think of hate, which is things separating, people not liking each other, people moving apart from each other. For Ojibwe, it's actually about how people come together, or how things come together, or how we're inspired with movement. When somebody says something we really dislike, which is actually what the word means, we feel disapproval, we shake our heads. And so that hate doesn't provoke us to move apart, but it moves us together. That's pretty fascinating stuff, and that really leads us to kind of what I think is a foundational principle of what Indigenous peoples, or Anishinaabe peoples that I know anyways, when we talk about reconciliation, we talk about decolonization, indigenization, or we talk about how do we move forward together as a treaty peoples, as a country, whatever it is that it really is led with love. And my father, I think, is one of the embodiments of that. He really taught me that you have to love first. You have to lead with kindness. And that if you hear many elders, they'll always say, be humble, or be kind to others, or always see yourself as not better, but the same as others. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. And I'm thinking a lot about love as a duty, not about this romantic kind of Hollywood kind of love, but actually love is like the responsibility. And so I've noticed that many of my columns are constantly talking about like how do we see things connected, or how do they work together. And what I realize is that I've been writing about love for a very long period of time. I might not have thought about it as love. Maybe it might look like the word for hate. And that maybe that is what we think of love, and that might be a way to move forward.
A little, maybe if you can, on that book that you're working on about denialism.
So yeah, that's with the University of Manitoba Press, and I'm working with Dr. Sean Carlton on that, and another book. So we actually have 2 books that we're working on together at the same time, and we're almost finished both, meaning we're at the finishing stages for both. The first one is a book on denialism, a residential school denialism. We have a whole series of individuals from all across the country who are talking about what it means to have certain segments, very small minorities, but very loud minorities, who are denying basic facts around residential schools, denying the unmarked graves that are now being searched at residential school sites, just completely without any evidence of saying this is true or untrue, not respecting that will take years and years to be able to search these sites, and then calling immediately the thing the hoax, and how damaging that is, how that's creating division. So that's a book that we have. It's an anthology that we're now finished. It's now out for review, and it will be probably out next year sometime. The other book that we're working on is a graphic novel about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so my father is one of the characters, but it's a retelling of what the TRC is, and what I don't want to give too much away, but just basically how the TRC came to be. And so it's going to be for young people, but it'll be coming out. The pencils are now being worked on, so we'll hopefully have that done by maybe next year, but graphic novels take a bit longer, so maybe a year and a half from now.
Very, very exciting. The first time I ever met you was a story about indigenizing graphic novels. So really looking forward to that. Niigaan, really appreciate you taking the time here. Looking forward to all of the new works that you have coming out. And of course, your weekly column and your weekly stop by here for the Truth and Politics panel. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, Miigwech, thanks for having me.
And that is all the time we have for this week's Face to Face. You can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website. You can also listen to any episode as a podcast by grabbing those wherever you find your audio. I'm Dennis Ward. Marcy Miigwech. We will see you back here in 7 days.